The year was 1886, and his 50-year-old Major Henry F. Schenk looked out onto the rolling mountains of Blowing Rock, North Carolina. He felt blessed to be in his position. As a textile mogul who was in the process of securing a very lucrative deal to open the Cleveland Cotton Mill and Power Plant, he had every right to be happy. There was, of course, no better place to celebrate his newfound success than at the small mountain resort nestled in the Blue Ridge, which was quickly becoming an immensely popular vacation destination. Frank, as he was known to those who knew his father as Henry, was right at the center of it. Having recently constructed a small cottage right in the middle of Main Street and being one of the first group to do so, the Major was able to enjoy all the luxuries Blowing Rock was able to accommodate at this time, as well as the natural splendor that this elite resort community was naturally endowed with. So who is Major Schenk? How was he important to early Cleveland County history? What is Blowing Rock? And why does this scene in 1886 matter? The answer to all of these questions can be found when studying the history of the Schenk family in Blowing Rock, North Carolina as two separate halves, which would create an inevitable whole. The story begins nearly 75 years prior to the construction of the Schenk home in Blowing Rock, when Major Henry Schenk's grandfather, Michael, constructed the first water-powered cotton mill in the South in 1813 in the tiny town of Lincolnton, North Carolina. Michael Schenk was born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, his grandfather having come to the colonies in 1709 to escape religious persecution for his Mennonite faith. Michael found immediate success with his cotton enterprise, building a larger operation shortly thereafter, and was able to leave his heirs $15,500 in total assets, equivalent to over $500,000 in today's money. When he died, Michael also had the first marble tombstone in the entire town of Lincolnton, which he bought from a merchant in Charleston nearly 35 years before his death. The Schenk family would continue in the entrepreneurial spirit as Henry Schenk Sr., Michael's oldest son, would go on to become a very prominent planter and merchant in the Gardeners Ford area of Cleveland County, which rested about 12 miles north of Shelby and was part of Rutherford County before Cleveland County was created from parts of Rutherford and Lincoln counties in 1841. Henry garnered a respectable reputation as a Whig supporter and was very politically connected on a local level. Out of this well-bred and elite heritage comes Major Henry F. Schenk, born in 1836 in Gardeners Ford. Frank was raised in his father's footsteps, quickly becoming an agricultural heavyweight himself. By the time the Civil War broke out, Schenk had already defined himself as a major player in Cleveland County high society, leading to his entrance into North Carolina's 56th Regiment Company F as a lieutenant. Shortly thereafter, he would receive the promotion to major, taking on the leadership of the Cleveland Rifles. The NC-56 would see battle in several locations, including Wilmington, Petersburg, and Appomattox Courthouse. It was during his time in the military that Major Schenk would contract tuberculosis, a disease which killed 14,000 troops during the war. This, in turn, would ruin his ability to lead. Towards his last days as a Confederate soldier, Schenk was reduced to whispering orders to his subordinates. He would then be honorably discharged in August of 1863 and sent home. Arriving back at home, the Major set about rebuilding his farm during unstable times. After the war, things on the farm were tense to say the least. However, most of Schenk's recently freed slaves decided to stay back and take a modest paycheck for their services, which allowed Schenk to rebuild his agricultural endeavors quickly. Although he was noticeably recovered from the tuberculosis, that didn't mean he was free from the scars of it. Every time he would do field work alongside his hired labor, he would quickly lose his breath and become exhausted. In 1866, Schenk received a presidential pardon for his role as a Confederate States of America government agent as the Gardeners Ford postmaster throughout the war. By the early 1870s, Schenk decided to follow in his grandfather's and many other up-and-coming industrialist footsteps and open a cotton mill using his own product to feed the looms. In 1873, he constructed his first mill, locally known as Schenk's Factory, on Knob Creek in what would become known as the Lawndale community. Schenk used the waters of Knob Creek to power his mill, which ran on a 50-horsepower steam engine. Schenk, much like his grandfather, saw instant success and quickly garnered the attention of James E. Reynolds, a northern industrialist who saw great potential in Schenk's small mill. In 1888, the two men would rebuild the little mill on Knob Creek and create the Cleveland Mill and Power Company, being equal partners. The pair had a fast friendship and were known to be very close even late in life. It was sometime during this newfound wealth that Schenk began to make his way to Blowing Rock, North Carolina. The area where the Cleveland Mill and Power Company was constructed would become known as Lawndale, which most attribute to the lush green lawns of mill workers' cottages. Lawndale would also house the first telephone system in Cleveland County in 1890, which ran to nearby Shelby. The village would officially be chartered as a town in 1903, and John F. Schenk was elected as the first mayor. Henry Schenk quickly became politically and economically powerful, which led to many connections within other growing industries such as the railroad industry. In 1899, Schenk oversaw the construction of a narrow-gauge railroad from Lawndale to Shelby, known as the Lawndale Dummy or Schenk's Dummy, as a means of moving his product more quickly. The Lawndale Railroad Company was created with Schenk as its president. Schenk even had his own private car on the railroad so he could ride in luxury into the neighboring town of Shelby. Henry Schenk would go on to become increasingly successful up until his death in 1915 of intestinal cancer. His son John would pick up where Henry left off by going on to build more mills in Cleveland County, including Lilly Mills, named after his wife, and continuing the operation of Cleveland Mills. Lilly Mills would go on to be recognized as one of the largest mill operations in Cleveland County, as well as an early place of work for bluegrass pioneer Earl Scruggs. The story of Blowing Rock, North Carolina is one with humble beginnings. It is important to note that at its creation in 1889, the town of Blowing Rock was beginning to become a very progressive resort area with a number of modern amenities. However, if you go back just 20 years, it looked entirely different. Blowing Rock began its life as most tourist destinations do, relatively uninhabited and relatively poor. Before the Civil War, Blowing Rock was still a frontier of sorts. Blowing Rock was small, being that the entire population of Watauga County at this time was 3,400, making it less than half the population of Cleveland County at the same time. The majority of these people lived in the county seat of Boone, North Carolina, with only handfuls of poor yeoman farmers living in the surrounding areas, including the area which would become Blowing Rock. During the Civil War, Watauga County became known as a passage for General Stoneman's Union forces who were heading through North Carolina on their way out of Tennessee. This was when places such as Blowing Rock first began to be realized for their natural beauty. Many soldiers on both sides of the conflict, but particularly in the Confederate forces, would remember their first encounters with Blowing Rock fondly and make return visits in the following years, setting up small cottages or just taking a vacation. It was after the Civil War that Blowing Rock began to see its success as a tourism destination because of three major factors. The first is the beginnings of vacation culture in the United States. For the first time, Americans were beginning to take vacations because for the first time, transportation was reliable enough to make trips relatively easy. The proliferation of railroad throughout the South following the Civil War made areas such as Blowing Rock much more accessible. In addition, a new toll road had been constructed to Blowing Rock, which greatly increased the viability of travel by stagecoach up the windy mountain passes. Also, Americans had more disposable income. The Civil War had made northern industrialists rich. This wealth would begin to creep its way into the South in the form of investments in manufacturing that would put big money into select southern pockets, which meant money to spend on extravagant trips that mirrored European sensibilities. The second major factor was viral marketing. After the Civil War, many doctors came out in favor of mountain regions for their more agreeable climates. The mountains were cooler, cleaner, and less humid than most southern cities at the time, which in the eyes of doctors and scientists meant they were places to escape the diseases that plagued urbanites leading up to and following the Civil War. Towns such as Asheville became known as sanctuaries for the treatment of tuberculosis, one of the largest diseases affecting urban populations in the South. Once hotels found out that doctors were recommending extended stays in the mountains to cope with disease, they took it and ran with it. By the 1870s, ads in newspapers were riddled with claims of the healing powers of the fresh mountain air, cool spring waters, and robust scenic exercise. Cleveland County even benefited from this early marketing by promoting its mineral springs for medicinal benefits. This transformed 19th century Shelby into a popular resort destination housing three major hotels, the last of which burned in 1929. Lithia water was piped from several miles north of Shelby to the Court Square, where people came near and far to buy it for medicinal qualities. The site of the well house is in current operation by the Earl Scruggs Center as a gift shop. The last major contributor to the growth of Blowing Rock was its celebrity endorsements. Once word had gotten out that Governor Zebulon Vance spent his summers in Blowing Rock alongside Senator Matthew Ransom, all of North Carolina's socialites were buying train tickets to Lenoir to find out what all the fuss was about. Along with these key political figures came artists such as Elliot Dangerfield, massive industrialists like the Cone family, who were known for inventing blue jeans, and even the operators of one of the largest gun manufacturers in the country, the Colt family, had a home for a short time in Blowing Rock. The question quickly shifted from who is going to Blowing Rock to who isn't, and by the late 1880s, Blowing Rock was boasting a summer season population of around 1,000 people, with a permanent population of just 150. With this newfound success came progress. Telegraph lines were put in, indoor plumbing became accessible, even electricity was added to the tiny town, all because of its overwhelming tourism population. Along with this came social progress. Dances were held at the various hotels around town, outside entertainment was brought in, and even the first car rode its way down Main Street in 1908. From 1870 to 1900, Blowing Rock saw its first of many major booms in terms of population, economy, and progress. So where does the story of Major Henry F. Schenk and Blowing Rock, North Carolina intersect? Well, the hardline intersection occurs in 1886 with the construction of the Schenk House on Main Street. However, the argument could be made that the histories of Schenk and Blowing Rock had run in parallel lines. Indeed, Schenk embodies each of the contributing motivations for going to Blowing Rock, making his living there seem almost inevitable. Schenk served in the Confederate military, he was an up-and-coming Southern industrialist, he was a constant political socialite, and he even had a battle with tuberculosis. When met with all of these factors, it seems as if the story of Major Schenk and Blowing Rock seemed tailor-made to fit together. Two pieces of a very large and complicated historical puzzle. In a lot of ways, this is how histories work and what makes studying history so exciting. The lifetime's worth of coincidences which can bring people and places together are something that makes up every single great history ever told. These connections are what makes stories so interesting for people. I am sure everyone has family stories that have to do with very specific places or events that seem completely random when they are told out of context, but when they are connected with other stories or histories, they make total sense. And that is how the story of Major Henry F. Schenk and Blowing Rock combine.